the question that you're asking, do other creatures have faith? I would say most definitely every other creature will behave as if it has faith, but faith does not, the experience of faith in most cases has no analogy whatsoever to what you would call faith.
Does it matter if they don't experience it if they're behaving as if?
Well, that's a, I mean, really, you got to turn the question on its head, because the the way most creatures do this makes a great deal of sense, right? They process things in a much more regular way, and there's a lot more gray area and nuance in what we do, which also means that a lot of the time we're a mess because our processing does not, it's not just looking for simple collections of parameters that tell you that this is the moment to deploy that behavior, right? You end up mulling on things and dwelling and, rethinking them and having arguments with yourself. And, in some ways, that's the interesting thing, is that we depart from the very functional way that most creatures accomplish survival and reproduction, and we do so in a way that has lots of downside. Being conscious is not easy.
Yeah, and I would say we're enabled to do that because we have ways of eating enough calories in order to do that work. I would quibble on your concept that genes give up control. I would rather say that your genes encode for a lot of flexibility or adaptability as a species. But maybe that's just kind of a semantics issue on
No,
my part.
it's
What
not semantic at all. But I probably don't mean what you think I mean. So it's fundamental. The genes don't give up any control at all over what the objective of the creature is, but they give up control over how it is accomplished, right? So it's like, trying to think of what the proper analogy.
Is that what epigenetics is?
Well,
yeah, kinda. No.
it's a can of worms
Epigenetics
because.
is the
Go ahead.
Epigenetics would be like the impacts of your environment cause different parts of your DNA code to become activated or inactivated, and that changes your phenotype. It changes the way your brain develops, or it might change how you encode for stress. So it changes how your DNA is functioning during your lifetime. And then if it occurs during pregnancy, it can be passed down.
So I'm going to depart from that slightly, I think, because my guess would be I'm substantially older than Lexi. And so the term epigenetic, I'm sure she will agree, means above the genome. And once upon a time, that was a very general category, and we had almost no information about the layer that we now call epigenetics, which is the regulation of genetic expression. And so when I was in college, for example, the first time I ever heard the term epigenetic, it was applied to culture. And if you think carefully about it, culture actually affects the way your genes function in the world, right? To the extent that your culture causes you to eat this food and not that food, it actually is interacting with your genome in a regulatory way that is loosely analogous to methylation or histone protein wrapping of chromosome of DNA. So in any case, I think it's actually very useful to retain that broad understanding of what epigenetic means. And then the final thing I would say is the hegemony of the genes, their control over the objective of the whole exercise is, it's not true in the individual's case. An individual can reject the genetic program, but over evolutionary time, the genes drive in the direction of greater fitness, and they use both culture and molecular epigenetic regulation to accomplish that. And my only point is that our cognition and our culture is a place where we have a great deal of freedom to figure out how to do what the genes are driving us toward, right? So anyway, again, I may be dragging us into the weeds, and I apologize if I am.
No, thank you. And I liked your definition of epigenetics. I came at it from I also heard it in undergrad, and yes, younger than you, so more recently. And I heard it in the context of neuroscience and how advances of like DNA research had started to find changes in your which alleles were expressed based off of those epigenetic changes on many of the factors that you mentioned in your definition. So it was cool to get the history. The one thing I would like to add, though, is that it's not as advantageous for species adaptiveness or ability to succeed if all members of that species have the same genes and the same behavior. And so one of the things that makes humans so adaptive and so successful is that as a species we have a variety of behaviors when faced with a crisis. So for example, with COVID-19, like the fact that some members of the species were very distrustful and didn't want to follow mandates, and that others members were more trustful of kind of an authoritarian, like regardless of which side was correct, the fact that as a species we exhibited both meant that irrespective of which one is right, the species has a better chance of surviving. And does that align with your understanding or your thoughts?
Well, I actually think you're being a little too cautious. I would say one thing that's very clear about human beings is that an individual human being cannot survive for a long period of time in any habitat on Earth. That we all depend on a division of labor and a diversity of insight, and that has been true for at least 6 million years and probably substantially more. So anyway, yes, the fact that it isn't about the individuals and it is about variation, and that variation exists from the genetic level right up through all of the epigenetic layers is certainly true. And then in the case of COVID, which is a novel threat, it may be a case where that diversity actually haunts us because, and I have my own perspective on this, but I would say we have botched and are continuing to botch and are increasing the level at which we are botching our reaction to COVID because it is a political, it is viewed through a political lens, and that the thing to do was to figure out what the best course was, which, yes, would have involved people of different view hashing it out. But then once we figured out what the plan was, for us all to get on board with it, which absolutely did not happen.
I mean, in this given situation, yes, but if all of the scientists had turned out to be wrong, which I'm not saying that they are, but if they had been by some fluke, then as a species, it would be advantageous to have had people who didn't agree.
Well, boy, are we going to get into a can of worms here, because as luck would have it, I think actually almost all of them are wrong, and that this is now playing out in a ridiculous way because social media
By
is,
them, are you alluding to scientists or humans?
well, I think you've got a kind of, there's a set of scientists whose viewpoint is now being imposed across all of the rest of us, and those few of us who will dissent are being increasingly hunted as witches, and this is very counterproductive. We really need to be having a much more frank argument about where we are and what to do about it. And because there's this sort of expectation that instead of science being a process, which is what it is, science is a set of conclusions that you can dispense, that we are now dispensing conclusions that are at best garbage and in many cases far worse. And it is resulting in people suffering a great deal of avoidable harm. And the irony is that the small number who are attempting to raise the alarm about this are facing the most incredible pushback imaginable, which I would say is probably invisible to most of you. Um, but on the ground, it is absolutely jaw dropping.
So I'm going to pull us back a tiny bit, but actually still be on this topic. So if we think about, and I like what you just sort of posited, where science is a process versus the conclusions, and that makes me think about, is it possible that the process is harder for people to trust and or understand to get to trust, or just put trust into, versus conclusions, which might be more easy to communicate and understand? Is that possible?
Well, um, was that directed at me? Because I'd love to answer.
Yeah, yes, it can be directed at you or the room. It's partially because it's some of the things that we've been talking about for the past 2 or 3 hours. But please do answer, and it'll, yeah, good fodder
Yeah,
for the room.
it's actually the reason I came in. I saw the title of your room and I thought, oh, geez, that stands to be an excellent discussion. What I would say is, if you imagine that we start with the politicization of everything, tearing apart the structures that are supposed to function. And this is resulting in a world where actually, can you trust what you don't understand? The answer is, in 2021, you cannot, right? I wish there was a way to do it. I wish there was a method I could tell you about. There is not. The way this is supposed to work is that we are supposed to agree that there is a certain set of rules that will allow us to deduce our best understanding of what is going on, and then we can tell you about it, right? So if you had universities that weren't polluted by the grant getting process and the influence of industry, for example, then you might be able to go to your scientific community and you might be able to ask, what should we think about COVID? How should we protect ourselves? What do we do? What does the future look like? And they might be wrong, but they wouldn't be wrong because they had perverse incentives. They'd be wrong because the situation is unclear. And that means that as it became obvious that it was unclear, the answer you got would get better. And so, what I do not like to be the person bearing this bad news, but we're really watching the collapse of every single institution that is in general supposed to tell you what the evidence suggests is true, right? The news media has completely failed in this regard. Our universities are effectively in free fall. Our governmental regulators are corrupt, and so what we get that best practices aren't best practices. Our understanding of these things is not actually the private understanding of the people dispensing it. It's what they want you to believe for reasons they don't share. And so, anyway, I think this is the number one problem that planet Earth has, is that we cannot afford, with the level of technology that we have, the level of interconnectedness that human beings have, a population of 7.5 billion people, we cannot afford to have confusion about what the objective of civilization is, and how we are going to seek truth and how we are going to deal with discovering that we've been wrong. The failure of the institutions is an existential threat, and it's, as I see it, priority one to get it back on track.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question here, because you said something interesting there where you said the way this is supposed to work. And I thought that was so interesting in terms of, why is it supposed to work that way? Like, why is that the way to make it work, versus is there not an alternative? Or is it work that way? Is that quote unquote better way because that's the way it's worked before, because it's rational, because like, what is this supposed to come from,
The
since we've been
suppo-
talking about faith and trusting what you don't understand?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I really do understand what you're saying and why what I'm saying sounds preposterous, precisely
Oh
because
no,
how
my
no,
questions do not imply, you don't know me. My questions don't imply that I don't believe what you're saying. It's just my way.
no, I hear you. I think your question was excellent. Let's leave it at that. Um, the answer is this: uh, human beings are evolved not for individual fitness. This is something my field has not yet figured out. But we are evolved for what I would call lineage persistence. That is to say, it doesn't matter that you have a ton of offspring if your tribe is jeopardized, right? If your tribe goes extinct, then all of the descendants of the offspring you created are going to go extinct too. And so, in a tribe, there tends to be tremendous agreement on what the goal is. There may be disagreement on whether to go this way or that way, but there's no disagreement on what would be desirable. And that's because there's shared fate. And in our system, our political and economic structures have actually caused us not to have shared fate, and therefore there are tensions. In other words, let's take an obvious example. The brochure says that we would like to figure out how to make schools that educate children as well as possible, right? That seems like what civilization should want. Of course, if you are in a position to purchase really high quality schooling for your children, it might be advantageous if other people's children weren't quite so well educated so that your children would outcompete them. So those two things are in tension. They shouldn't be, and they wouldn't be in an ancestral circumstance. And my claim is that the fact that we have different interests means that we are going to destroy ourselves. And one can make a rarefied philosophical argument that maybe that's not such a bad thing. But I think for any of us who would reject that argument and say, yeah, actually, I'd like human beings to persist as long as possible. I'd like them to be well. I'd like them to be liberated, right? If those things sound good to you, then getting on that page involves rescuing the institutions that are capable of protecting us.
So are you saying that the supposed to comes more from a, if we're all working towards like our the community all moving forward, then we would be trying to align all our interests in that way. But that would imply that might be evolutionary what we were built for. But what if this is like a step function and it's no longer possible? Then wouldn't we want
Well,
a different system? Like what if there's a different system now
so
that would have to work within this one?
I'm feeling bad. I feel like I hijacked your room, and I don't want to have done that.
Well, a little bit, but it's actually very much, I feel like we've talked a lot about, you know, to me this actually circles, it somewhat circles back to this question for me, because we have the COVID question has come through in a couple different ways. And I think there's this question about like everything you're describing. Like I think about evolutionary, we did talk very early on about, trust being evolutionarily adaptive, right? And so that this is good for almost, I think Owen brought it up mostly from an individual perspective. And I think what you're bringing up is more it's good for the species or the community, but perhaps that's in tension with our modern current, like we don't use the example of like, if my kid does better than your kid, then maybe perhaps that's better for me. So to me, that actually circles back a little bit to what even Joan's question, which is perhaps now there's something different. Like there's like a break in what we as a species, how we think about trust, right? Like, and how we think about faith, since that was the most recent question we were asking between trust and faith. And that perhaps before this trust piece was really adaptive, but I think that what you're sharing, there's something like, it's not worked out for me, which is why I'm asking you questions. But it feels like, well, maybe has there been a break in how we're relating, and therefore some of these trust and faith questions are different now. That's why I'm asking. So it's a little different, but it actually feels relevant to some of the questions we've been having. That's why.
Okay.
So,
Well, again, excellent
but
question.
yes.
Let me say, so we're sort of delving into a piece of work that I've been on for, I don't know, a decade and a half. And so I'm just going to give you the sort of punchline of it, and we can talk about, if people want to know why it's the punchline, we can go back. But the punchline is we actually have to reject our evolutionary imperative because it will kill us sooner rather than later, right? We are designed for lineage against lineage competition, and if we keep playing that game with the kinds of weapons we have and the kind of interconnectivity and the industrial scale of civilization, we will not be around 200 years from now. So we do have to depart for something new. And I think this is absolutely clear. But I also think if we were to spend time on the question of what should civilization be for, right? What's the objective? I think you come out, a reasonable room of people will come out with the idea that being a human is a gift. That gift is degraded if you are not free because your economic circumstances, for example, don't allow you. Basically, you have to sell all your time to somebody else, right? So if you play that game, what you come out with is we're actually obligated to deliver a liberated human life to as many people as we can. And that means we have to preserve planet Earth. We can't keep degrading it. We have to get population under control. And I don't mean that anybody has to leave, but I mean we cannot live at a population level that sustainability becomes impossible. The way to get the largest number of humans to have the wonderful experience of being human is to have them, live generation after generation without destroying the planet they live on. And if you see it that way, then, the rest is a question of, okay, what system makes us safe enough to live indefinitely here? And what system distributes opportunity well enough that the lives that are generated are not wasted on pointless tasks, but actually allow people to do what we are capable of? And I'll say one more thing, which is all evolved creatures have the same purpose. That purpose is therefore a completely pointless and indefensible purpose. If your purpose is the same as COVID-19's purpose, then it's not a defensible purpose. And that means we sort of have to write ourselves a new purpose. On the flip side, though, human beings, which have the same purpose as every other evolved creature, have a impossibly beautiful toolkit for accomplishing that purpose. Our ability to reason, to extrapolate, to be compassionate, to make beauty. All of these things are marvelous, and most of them are almost uniquely human. And we basically should take them back from evolution, and we should redirect them towards, a planet in which people's lives are full of meaning, and we can allow generations to discover what we should be doing over time. So anyway, something like that.
I have a question, and I mean, this could be at you, Brett, or it could be at anybody, but it seems like a lot of what you're saying is that as humans, we need to agree on something. And so I'm wondering if you think, like, is what we agree on as important as us all, like, let's say there was some alternate universe that all human beings could, like, like all just have like the same belief system and we're all united in that. Would that be successful regardless of what that belief system is? We could use like Christianity and atheism. If we were all atheists, would we be happy? If we were all Christians, would we be happy?
I would say no. Resounding no.
Yeah, I mean, I will. Again, the questions in this room are excellent. The if you think about what it is that I've advocated, what I've advocated is a system in which we all have to believe in the fact that we all get to believe what we want, right? So, in other words, what we have to be united in is the idea that you should be liberated to do what you want to do. And we can talk a lot, that may sound libertarian, and there is one piece of libertarian philosophy. But the point is, what we're really talking about is unconstraining people, giving them room to discover what what we might want to know or what we might want to have that we don't know about. And so to say that we all need to agree on that is probably true, right? Anybody who likes, for example, who prefers the idea that this is all a power game and we should see who's most powerful and they should subjugate everyone else, and that's your right. Yeah, we have to shut those people down, but we're shutting them down in order to provide liberty. And it seems to me that as much as, you know, I don't like the idea we have to shut anybody down, that's the way you minimize the number of people you have to shut down and maximize uh, the value that is most likely to be agreed upon by the largest number.
Sean, you've been in for a little bit. Do you have a thought here? Also, hi.
Hi. So many thoughts, but I want to keep just listening for a minute longer.
I mean, to Brett's point, I was listening to Jim Green talk in a room, and for people that don't know who he is, he's the chief scientist at NASA, and he comes on here a lot and talks. And I was listening to him talk about, astrological megastructures the other day, and how, we as humans need to start endeavoring on these projects that are going to take multi generations of, centuries and probably even um, millennia to complete. I mean, you think about cathedrals, they were multi-generational projects, and humanity has endeavored on these sorts of large things before. And they're things that bring people together. And nothing, I can't really think of anything larger than a astrological monolith, which came to heating up, cooling down Venus and then heating up Mars, and all this stuff. So, I'd say that's probably a direction that we probably need to start heading into.
Well, that's a pretty big aspirational goal there. I like it, kind of David Deutsch
Go
style.
big or go home.
Yeah, exactly. I think what I see two trends that are kind of converging. One is institutional decay, uh, which is the real cause of the institutional failure. Institutional decay, Francis Fukuyama wrote a couple books on it. Spectacular dissection of how political systems are created and how they decay, if you're curious about it. But I think we have decaying systems which allow them to be at risk of failure or distrust, more so than they're just, uh, it's a change in the system. But there is a change in the system. I would contend that our process of information has changed dramatically. We used to have an expert to help us find a needle in a haystack, and that's what the expert was for, and we trusted the expert to find it for us. But now technology gives us a haystack full of needles, and we have to try to figure out which one we want. And unfortunately, they're trying to hijack our reptilian brain to convince us which needle to look at, and we're not using our rational systems. But there is a real technological change. There's vast amounts of free information we didn't have before, and there are people who are critical thinkers who can take advantage of that. And there's a lot of other people who don't know what the heck to do with it all because they're just overwhelmed with the data.
Yeah, I'm one of those people that just takes in large amounts of data like that. I listen to podcasts, and that most people put them out for free, and you tend to learn a lot of shit, hours and hours and hours. So, yeah, yeah.
Can I ask?
So go ahead, Sean. Go ahead.
Okay, I've heard, Brett, you and Eric talking in a few rooms about, the problems with the institutions, and, they seem to have gotten really good at getting more and more entrenched and, gaining power, building themselves up as the only legitimate purveyors of a particular kind of idea or research or way of directing society. How do you get around that? Like, do you think that it's possible to topple them, or do you change them from within, or like, what are your thoughts?
Oh boy, I really don't like being this guy, but I think we have I don't know, what would it be, a 4 alarm fire, a 5-star emergency? I think the collapse of the institutions is advanced well beyond what most people think. COVID is actually revealing this. I think most people can't see it yet, but they will. Lab leak is chapter 1. But once you spot this, the degree of justifiable fear over what broken institutions can do in the context, it'd be different if we were talking about a world of many separated cultures where one culture could make terrible errors and maybe even go extinct, or at least the culture could blink out, and there's other places to reboot from. We don't have that luxury. We're one planet now. We're tied together. We keep finding out that some part of the apparatus is building dangerous structures that it doesn't know what to do about when they fail. And having worked inside of some of these institutions and attempting to get them to behave reasonably, I have to say I think it's all but hopeless. I also think the prospect of building them from scratch is similarly daunting, maybe slightly better, but we don't really have time for it. So I think we need to come up with an emergency plan, and we need to come up with sort of, core, some core structures that function, that can build outward to larger things. And, you know, I don't exactly know how you do that, because at the moment, any attempt to build a structure that can think independent of the um, political persuasive force is immediately shut down as a threat. There are still individuals who can think, but anytime you try to group them into some sort of a structure, it is targeted, derailed, captured, lobotomized, and we can't go on like this. I literally believe we can't go on like this.
I mean, every time until it's not, right?
Well, maybe I should just sum up my comment like this and say, you can see it all. The story of COVID reveals it all. And if you just take what we will ultimately know about COVID and you extrapolate and you say everything works like this, it's just that I can see it with COVID because it all spilled out into the open, then you'll know where we are.
So I find myself in like a really interesting feeling or sentiment right now, where I feel like listening to that comment from you like really embodied the question of this room, which is, can you trust what you don't understand? Because I'm not seeing what you've seen, and I don't understand what levers you're talking about, and I'm not certain which pieces of evidence have swayed you to hold that belief. And I'm questioning, do I trust your take on that? And
You shouldn't. You shouldn't unless you know me, which you might. But if you
and
don't know me, then no, of course not.
I guess I'd like to kind of like ask the room, like, does anyone else feel that, or how would I go about deciding whether or not to trust in this argument or theory that Bret has posed?
Well, I mean, to be completely honest, I've come to this conclusion a long time ago, and I still have to operate as if it's not true, though, and I still have to operate in the world, and I'm just, right now an anonymous individual. I don't have, Brett's notoriety, nor do I want that. It's a burden. So it's a hard pill to swallow once you come to these sorts of realizations about the way the world works.
I mean, to me, it was a loaded question because I resonated very much with what Bret was saying. I've also, and thanks Wayne for mentioning Fukuyama. Michael Mann is another kind of really interesting writer. Peter Turchin. I think I have a kind of a KK, my co-researcher, and I have an interesting trajectory in this, in that we started looking at all of the macro level research on why stuff might be broken and why that stuff that's broken might really keep pointing in the direction of institutions. And I would be happy to kind of share any of the kind of really suggestive and interesting articles that I've been looking at that kind of point in that direction. But there's like lots of books and academic research from a macro perspective. And from the macro perspective, Peter Turchin, Fukuyama, and so on, things look pretty grim, because it seems clear that these institutions have figured out how to kind of get their tentacles kind of into reality so powerfully, and they've put themselves as the intermediaries. So like, let's talk about higher education. Basically 50 years ago, you had CEOs of major kind of industrial kind of economic powerhouses who hadn't got a degree, because they worked their way up. Like head of Goldman Sachs started in the mailroom. Great manufacturing companies. It was possible to work your way up. But now, getting a degree is the gatekeeper. And the degree granting institutions, kind of ranked by prestige, have kind of managed to make it to become part of an evolution of society such that you won't even get promoted if you don't have the right degrees, because it's too risky. And so they are now intermediaries, and you have to pay a toll. And once the only road to get from where you are to where you want to go has this toll booth in it, then the business of the people who own the toll booth is, well, let's see how big we can build this. I mean, let's just keep squeezing. And so you look at the rise in the cost of degrees, and it's just insane. But that's what you get when you get these intermediaries. Or look at the rise in the number of lawyers. Since the 1970s, I think it's grown relative to the population by something like 3 or 4x. So you kind of get this kind of elite class that are kind of working within these institutions that are basically acting as intermediaries, but they're also kind of in control, because they need to kind of extract their toll, their taxes, but they also need to make sure that they have enough control and capture of the whole system so that no one can do kind of an end run around them. So that's the kind of direness and the macro level diagnosis. But KK and I spent the last decade actually just as engineers figuring out how to create conditions for people to learn much faster, because we thought that there was a ton of research that wasn't being used and combined and kind of iterated on in a systematic way. And once we got to kind of 10x, we started realizing that the real game was the ground level engineering of institutions. And so we kind of came up with this term of a nano institution and a micro institution, which is like, what do you build when you're building the very first instance of what is going to grow to become an institution? And I claim that there's an engineering discipline there, and I claim that KK and I invented it or discovered a lot of the principles that can make it work. And so I actually, I know that there's a big gulf between like engineering the beginnings of an institution and starting to see it take off inside the situations that we've worked, but it suddenly seems like a much more bridgeable gulf.
Okay, so what I've heard there, so one was that you said that I could rely on authority. So that was kind of Bret's first comment. He's like, well, if you haven't heard of me. And then I think it was Dana and Sean, you both echoed that authority was a way that I could trust in his comments. And then
Not
both,
authority. Not authority. You could trust in my comments somewhat if you had, for example, spent some months watching me think through things with Heather, for example, on the podcast. If you'd done that, then you would have seen me make errors. You would have seen how I dealt with it. You would have seen me predict things ahead of time that seemed crazy, and then they came true. And the point is, you'd have a basis for evaluating it. So it isn't that somebody's an authority. It's that you're able to see a track record that would tell you where to trust, where not to trust, that sort of thing.
okay,
But in this room, Lexi gets told, I would even say it's authority, and I would, since we talked about influence earlier, I would also say it's just a social proof that basically other people who you might trust say you can trust Bret. Continue, Lexi.
Okay, thank you. And then the second thing that you came up with was experience. And so you kind of you recognize that Bret's comments were very high level, which was the first thing that actually flagged for me. He said, over and over, like, if you look at what's happening, and COVID will tell you the story, but he never actually told me the story. He didn't say a single, like, that I heard. He didn't say something that was like, here is a clear example of what COVID-19 has demonstrated is wrong with these institutions. He just kind of said, COVID will tell us a story. And that was, like, that's a very common tool of rhetoric. And it can be very persuasive, because if you have examples that jump to mind that you already believe in, then you're more likely to believe the speaker's point, as opposed to me. I didn't have a lot of examples, and in the absence of them, I was sitting there going, okay, but tell me a piece of evidence. But so then Dana and Sean both provided those. Are there other ways that I can trust this? And then also, sorry, sidebar, I'm not going to let you say that the good old days of CEOs where you could work your way up an institution was better when all of those CEOs were white and male. Because there are some problems with the current situation, yes, but they've also created some much needed diversity in that portfolio. And how do we maintain that benefit without falling into the horrors that you're kind of predicting?
Okay.
So those are my two questions.
Okay, I love that. Thank you. And absolutely, I mean, the level of inequity kind of in terms of like who got to the job in the mailroom and who got to work their way up, absolutely, absolutely agreed. And so, I'm not saying that that was a glorious time. I'm just saying that that period of history was a period in which a different player kind of managed to become the intermediary. And so now you don't need to be white and male, but you need to either be one of the tiny handful of people who get chosen to get a full ride, or to be willing to go, I don't know, $150,000, $250,000 in debt. And if you just look at like socioeconomic status relative to, the percentage of people at Princeton, Harvard, and so on, you see that like one kind of inequity has been switched for another. And so, absolutely, I was not at all saying that like the past was had less inequity. And I definitely know that like today's system, like the people inside the system, the individuals inside the system, are absolutely going all out to try to kind of level the playing field as individuals. But the system itself, like the institutions themselves, kind of seem to grind forward by this inexorable logic of that drives them in directions which often run counter to all of the people inside them, what they would wish. And so the kind of macro data tells you that. But in relation to COVID, here's one thing that I did last year. It turns out that you can kind of look at government records on how much the government has spent on pandemic preparedness in prior years. And they've been spending $200, $300 million a year on pandemic preparedness, given out to a bunch of different kind of government divisions and also healthcare systems. So that's taxpayer money. And then, when $5 million is spent on a pandemic preparedness plan for some kind of part of government, often there's a record of what the tender was, who was hired, and what the plan was, and you can download it. So I have 10,000 pages on my hard drive of these pandemic preparedness plans. And it's a really interesting exercise to start reading through that stuff. It's in the public record, and you can kind of, draw your own conclusions about like, was all of these hundreds of millions of dollars of pandemic preparedness planning, was it some kind of, charade, some kind of ritual where the people who were involved were just figuring out how to line their pockets or build their fiefdoms, and no one actually truly, from my point of view, it kind of looked like no one in the system actually gave a shit about whether this was going to work or not. Like no one said, let's run an actual simulation. Like, let's do this. People were saying, okay, 50-page plan, that looks good, but maybe a 100-page plan would be even better. You know, I mean, you just start reading it and it just starts to look so atrocious and so different than what you would do if you needed to kind of prepare for a pandemic in a tiny kind of country where you were kind of in control of and you had a tight budget. And so, you know, that to me was one really telling and fascinating kind of tiny little, you know, slice of reality that I could kind of dip straight into, which, you know, cut past the kind of, you know, what is kind of academic research doing around, you know, where they investigate and so on, which of course has all of this other technical stuff that makes it kind of more impenetrable. And I'd be happy to kind of share some of the links with you, Lexi, if you happen to have any curiosity on that.
Yeah, that would be great. So for disclosure, I live in Canada, where we had pandemic preparedness plans that differed, but were very much interrelated with how the United States handled the COVID-19 pandemic and its emergence, because we have such a strong trade and political relationship with the country. And so, I mean, if we're gonna, so that's a great point. And I mean, I'd love to kind of talk about like the impact of socialized medicine and, you know, like the fact that our university tuitions are a quarter of what yours are. But I feel like that's kind of getting away from the question of the room. So I'd like to take a temperature of the room, which is, do you want me to like pull it back to
Lexi, I came up actually to give my own unsolicited temperature gauge.
Are you going to do a temperature check for me, Maceo, or were you going to contribute
No,
to?
I'm just
Were
going
you
to
going
tell
to
you.
answer for Sean or for Lexi?
I'm just going to
I
be
thought
the thermometer of my own self, and I will say, Lexi, I want to give Lexi flowers for holding it
Yep,
down in the room,
yep.
and really just bringing great feedback and questioning and keeping the conversation stimulating and interesting, and I always value Sean's input. So that was one thing, and then I was gonna also say it might be time for a reset because I have no idea what we're talking about. But that was all I was gonna say.
But
This is
Maceo,
good.
you know me. You know that I don't reset. I
Well,
reset
no, but
softly. So to ask
I
for a
was.
reset in this room is a
I'm just.
sacrilege thing. So we're gonna power flex for a
I
moment and
honestly,
move
but
Maceo
Tanya,
down to the audience, and then I'll
but
bring him back up because I love him.
but Tanya, I wanna,
I
I
Go
kind of
love
ahead,
wanted
it.
to
Dana.
bring
Go
it
ahead,
back
Dana.
around because
No, I will bring back. I'll bring back with love, Maceo. Go ahead, Dana.
yeah.
And if
So
I
to tie it back to what Brett said earlier, maybe about a half an hour ago, Sean gave us a really illustrative example of society and the system as a whole, you know, evolving to the point where, you know, this is what its purpose is, and it's not evolving for particular individuals. It's just this is the system that is set up, and we're all sort of participants in it. And this is where it's kind of driving towards. So, you know, it was a theme that, you know, is sort of been bouncing around, but the COVID thing, I mean, he already said about the lab leak. You know, that's a really common theory that's been floating around in the news. It's, you know, it's no secret. So it's been all over the place. But any contribution, Mace, you know, we love what you say.
no, that was well played, Betania, and this feels like November or something or whenever. This is really great.
I can do what I would call a soft reset, but as is the things. Um, but I think it's been so. It's interesting to me because Brett kind of came in maybe half an hour after we'd been talking about trust and sort of understanding and having a really rich conversation. And one of the things that I mentioned to the room, which was that as I prepared for this room, I had really thought through how I was going to navigate not keeping off the discussion off of faith, but I didn't want the whole room to be about faith, even though I knew that that's something we would talk about. And what I actually brought to the room was actually that we had been talking for 2 hours and no one had brought up faith. And so I was sort of positing to the room about why that is, especially when we talk about a conversation where it's about trusting something that perhaps is not understandable. And so we were talking about that for a little while. Joan asked this question, which I actually don't think we've really super unpacked, but around the difference between trust and faith. And then Bret came in and gave us this definition to play with around faith being sort of this thing that isn't moved with evidence, right? I'm paraphrasing a little bit, which we then sort of started to unpack into all sorts of things with. Oh, and then I asked Brett a question about whether he thought that there was that animals had faith, and then we sort of got into this age, which I love. And since it's burnt chicken, I let the conversations flow a little bit and stay within the topic and the context and the frame that we have, but definitely within sort of the space that we're in. So that is about as hard of a reset that I think I ever do. But I give you that, Macy. Does that give you some context for where we are a little bit? And I can give you some context too about some of the discussions we had earlier about trust. And I think one of the things I will share for the room is that I've been observing is that I think that there's sort of one thing I noticed too is that trust, we didn't explicitly talk about this, but in the ways that different people have shared about trust. No, and I also really want to call out Asia, who I'm so grateful for having been here tonight, because she gave us this example and a lot of stories about the military, right? And sort of when people give orders and soldiers or people in the military just trust what their superiors say and don't ask questions, sort of what that is. And so we talked about that. So I really want to shout that out specifically. And I say that because trust, I think, has been used, I've noticed, in this case of where we trust another person. Often that was a parent, could be a superior, could be someone trying to persuade us into something, kind of as Lexi was sort of alluding to earlier. But also there's been this use of trust in terms of trusting ourselves and in trusting sort of what we ourselves notice. And we haven't explicitly called that out, but I've just been observing how people use that in different ways. And then we've sort of slid by a little bit this idea about understanding in terms of how deeply that understanding goes, and people have been, again, without explicitly calling it out, been thinking about understanding at different levels. And I'm definitely left with the question, I think it was Aisha who talked about storytelling, but we were talking about storytelling a little bit earlier. I'm still left with the question of, can you trust something, whether it's for yourself or another person presenting it to you, where you have no understanding of the context, where there is no story told to you around it, where where perhaps it is a little closer to what we might define as faith, which brings us back to Joan's question of trust versus faith. Like, what is that distinction? And Joe's positive that I think you said they were similar but not the same, I think is how you sort of offered it to the room as something to possibly unpack. So that's kind of some of the places that we've been. And yeah, if someone wants to add in something here, I mean, if not, I'm super happy to do sort of our burnt chicken sort of collective close. But if what I've just recapped inspires you to give an additional thought, please feel free.